Ethan Caldwell was a man of steadfast determination. Approaching his late 50s, he had dedicated countless years to his career as a structural engineer, carefully designing and constructing edifices meant to endure for generations. However, in recent times, life had presented him with obstacles that no set of plans could have anticipated. 2 years earlier, his wife Linda had unexpectedly passed away, leaving him in possession of an expansive tract of land on the fringes of a burgeoning suburban neighborhood. At the center of this property stood an aged shed, weathered by the elements yet brimming with legacy, a structure that had belonged to her family for many generations. To Ethan, the shed was more than just a structure. It represented the life they had crafted together and the cherished moments they had shared. When Linda's relatives proposed selling the land, viewing it as a liability rather than a treasure, Ethan had declined. The shed had become his sanctuary, a project to divert his mind from his sorrow, and a space where he could invest his expertise into something profoundly personal. In its current state, the shed was not particularly appealing. Its once vibrant blue paint had dulled to a muted teal. The wooden planks groaned ominously with each gust of wind, and the roof bowed under the strain of years of neglect. Yet Ethan saw its potential. He imagined restoring it to its original splendor, transforming it into a woodworking atelier where he could finally engage in the craft Linda had always encouraged him to pursue. Every squeak of the floorboards and every fissure in the beams told a story, and Ethan was committed to preserving that history with a series of meticulous plans spread out on his dining room table and a collection of reclaimed wood awaiting use. He had embarked on the slow, intentional process of revitalizing the shed. However, Ethan's aspirations for the shed did not sit well with his neighbor, Sandra Palmer. Sandra had resided next door for as long as Ethan could recall, and she was a formidable presence. Self-styled as the neighborhood's protector, Sandra had a talent for involving herself in everyone's affairs. She held strong opinions on property boundaries, garden designs, and even the hues of mailboxes. What made her truly exasperating was her ability to craft a narrative that always cast her in the role of the aggrieved party. If a dog barked excessively or a tree limb encroached on her fence, Sandra was quick to escalate the issue with a barrage of complaints and subtle threats. Ethan had mostly managed to keep her on his good side, maintaining a courteous yet distant relationship, though he always harbored a lingering suspicion that her friendliness was more strategic than sincere. When Sandra first noticed Ethan working on the shed, she made a casual remark that Ethan found peculiar. "You know, my great-great-grandmother used to own this land," she had said one afternoon, leaning over the fence that separated their properties. "It's practically a part of our family legacy." Ethan had laughed politely and continued his work, dismissing her comment as one of her many embellished stories. But in the weeks that followed, Sandra's interest in the shed appeared to intensify. She began posing more incisive questions about his plans, her tone shifting from mere curiosity to something resembling scrutiny. "Are you certain you're permitted to make all these modifications? I heard that structure might qualify as a historical landmark," she pondered one day. On another occasion, she suggested that the shed might be better utilized as a community facility rather than a private workshop. Ethan began to feel uneasy, but chose not to confront her directly. He was already balancing his part-time consulting work with the physical demands of restoring the shed and lacked the energy to deal with neighborhood tensions. However, Sandra's actions became increasingly difficult to overlook. One morning, Ethan discovered her wandering around the shed, peering through the broken panes as though she had every right to be there. When he addressed her, she dismissed it with a charming laugh. "I was just admiring it," she said. "You know, it really does have so much potential." Despite her persistent and unsettling behavior, Ethan continued with his plans. He dedicated his evenings to repairing the shed's foundation, replacing decayed wood, and even setting up a temporary workspace inside. Each nail he drove felt like a small victory, a way to reclaim control over something meaningful. Yet his progress was gradual, and the shed remained a work in progress. That's when events began to take a bizarre twist. Upon returning home from a 2-week visit to his brother, Ethan was met with an unfamiliar scene. Trucks were parked on his property, workers were unloading materials, and scaffolding had been erected around the shed. A large banner stretched across the front, emblazoned with the words, "Palmer's Heritage Gas Station opening soon." Ethan stood frozen, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was witnessing. The shed he had been restoring was no longer just a neglected structure needing attention. It had become the focal point of what seemed to be an active construction site. The workers moved with determination, installing fuel dispensers and preparing the ground for what looked like a parking lot. His heart raced as he approached the nearest worker, demanding an explanation. The man shrugged and pointed toward Sandra's house. "You'll need to speak with the manager," he replied before turning back to his duties. Furious, Ethan stormed over to Sandra's front door and pounded until she answered. She greeted him with her usual overly sweet smile, but there was a spark of triumph in her eyes that sent shivers down his spine. "Sandra, what is going on?" Ethan demanded. "Why are there construction crews on my property?" Sandra feigned surprise, her voice dripping with feigned innocence. "Oh, Ethan, I thought you were aware. That shed is a historical landmark, and I've taken the initiative to transform it into something the entire community can enjoy." "Isn't that exciting?" Ethan felt his fists clench as he struggled to contain his anger. "That shed is on my land, Sandra. You have no right to do this." Her smile remained unchanged. "Well, that's where you're mistaken. I recently found some old documents suggesting the shed might actually fall within the original boundaries of my property. I've already filed the necessary paperwork with the city. You should verify your records. You might find things aren't as straightforward as you think." Sandra's words filled Ethan with dread. He knew she was lying. There was no way the shed wasn't his. However, her confidence and the rapid pace of the construction indicated she wasn't bluffing about having some form of leverage. As Ethan stood there, simmering with anger, Sandra patted him patronizingly on the shoulder. "Don't worry, Ethan. Once everything is operational, I'm sure you'll see how beneficial this will be for the neighborhood." The door closed in his face, leaving Ethan alone on her porch as he walked back to the shed. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just another of Sandra's ploys. It was a calculated maneuver, and she wasn't adhering to the same rules as everyone else. Ethan was certain of one thing: this wasn't over. He spent the rest of the evening pacing his living room, his mind racing with unanswered questions. How had Sandra managed to commence construction on his property without his consent? What was she attempting with her claims about the shed encroaching her property lines? The notion seemed ludicrous. He possessed all the paperwork proving his ownership of the land, but Sandra's assured manner suggested she had a strategy. Over the years, Ethan had learned enough about his neighbor to recognize that Sandra didn't bluff. She was manipulative, calculating, and unafraid to bend the rules to achieve her desires. If she had reached this point, she must have something up her sleeve. The following morning, Ethan wasted no time. He retrieved the folder containing all the legal documents for his property, the deed, property line surveys, and even the permits he had obtained for minor renovations when he first began restoring the shed. Everything was in order, and each piece of evidence confirmed that the shed was firmly within his boundaries. However, as he reviewed the papers, he realized that facts and logic might not suffice to stop Sandra. If she had already submitted her alleged documents to the city, it could take weeks or even months for the matter to be resolved through official channels. In the meantime, Sandra's gas station would likely be operational, leaving him with an even greater battle ahead. Determined to find answers, Ethan drove straight to the city zoning office. The clerk behind the counter was courteous but clearly overwhelmed, her desk buried under stacks of files and forms. When Ethan explained the situation, she frowned sympathetically and entered his address into her computer. After a few moments, she nodded and handed him a printout. "Your property is definitely registered under your name, including the shed," she said. "But it looks like there's been a recent claim submitted by your neighbor. She's filed a request to have the shed designated as a historical site, which could potentially grant her some rights to it, depending on the circumstances." Ethan's stomach churned. "What kind of circumstances?" he asked. The clerk hesitated, evidently reluctant to get involved in what was clearly a heated neighborly dispute. "Well," she began carefully, If she can prove that the shed has historical significance or that it was part of her property in the past, the city might place restrictions on what you can do with it. If the claim is approved, she could potentially petition for partial ownership. However, these cases are rare and require substantial evidence. Ethan clenched his jaw. She doesn't have evidence. She's fabricating this. The clerk offered an apologetic shrug. You'll need to contest her claim. I can provide you with the forms to file a counter request, but the process might take some time. Time was something Ethan didn't have. By the time he left the zoning office, his mind was already racing with strategies to thwart Sandra before her plans advanced any further. He decided to confront her again, this time armed with the full weight of his legal documents. When he arrived at her front door, she opened it with the same infuriating smile she had worn the previous day, as if she had been anticipating his arrival. "Ethan, what a surprise. Here to see the progress on our new gas station?" She greeted him cheerfully. Ethan disregarded her tone and held up the folder in his hands. "Sandra, this needs to stop. I have the deed to my property, the surveys, everything. This shed is mine, and you're trespassing. If you don't shut this down, I'll be forced to take legal action." Sandra's smile didn't falter. In fact, she seemed almost amused. "Legal action, huh? That's quite dramatic, don't you think? Especially when we're talking about something that might not even belong to you." She folded her arms and leaned casually against the doorframe. "You see, Ethan, I've done my research. Did you know that this shed was part of my family's property back in the 1930s? I have documents proving it, and I've already submitted those to the city, along with a request to have the shed protected as a historical site. So, while you're busy waving your papers around, the wheels are already in motion. I'd suggest you save yourself the headache and just let this happen." Sandra's words struck Ethan like a blow to the chest. He knew she was lying, but the calm, confident manner in which she delivered her narrative made it clear she had no intention of backing down. For a moment, he was too stunned to respond. Sandra took his silence as an opportunity to assert her position. "I really am doing this for the good of the community. That old shed has been neglected for years. Don't you think it's better to put it to good use? A gas station will bring people together, create jobs, and improve our neighborhood. Isn't that what Linda would have wanted?" At the mention of his late wife, something within Ethan snapped. He stepped forward, his voice low and icy. "Don't you dare involve her in this." Sandra raised her hands in mock surrender, a smirk playing on her lips. All right. No need to get emotional. I'm just saying you might want to consider the bigger picture here." Ethan turned sharply and walked away, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles whitened. He could feel Sandra's eyes on him as he crossed the yard, her smug satisfaction emanating from her porch. Upon reaching the shed, he paused to take in the sight of it, now almost unrecognizable beneath the scaffolding and construction equipment. Workers moved about, scarcely acknowledging him as he stood there, seething. One of them, a burly man with a clipboard, finally approached him. "Hey, buddy, you can't be here. This is an active site," the man said gruffly. "This is my property." Ethan shot back, "The shed is mine." The man shrugged, clearly uninterested in the dispute. "Take it up with the manager," he said, gesturing toward Sandra's house. Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked back to his own home, his mind racing with plans. Over the next few days, Ethan threw himself into action. He filed the counter request with the city, as the clerk had suggested, and began gathering every piece of evidence he could find to support his case. He contacted the surveyor who had conducted the most recent property line assessment, hoping to obtain an updated report to present to the city. He even reached out to a local attorney, explaining the situation and seeking advice on how to proceed. The lawyer, a pragmatic woman named Alice Thompson, listened attentively before giving him a straightforward assessment. "This sounds like a classic case of property encroachment," she said. "If her documents are forged, which they likely are, it should be easy to prove in court. But you need to act quickly. The longer this drags on, the harder it will be to reverse whatever she's trying to do." Alice's words provided Ethan with a glimmer of hope, but also underscored the urgency of the situation. Sandra wasn't merely trying to inconvenience him. She was attempting to seize something that was immensely important to him. Moreover, she was doing so openly. As days passed, Ethan began to notice other, more disturbing signs of Sandra's determination. One morning, he discovered a pile of garbage dumped at the edge of his driveway, consisting of old papers, broken tools, and decaying food that stank in the summer heat. Another day, he saw a group of unfamiliar men walking along the perimeter of his property, their faces obscured by baseball caps. When he called out to them, they ignored him and vanished into the woods. The final straw came when Ethan returned home one evening to find a bright yellow sign nailed to the ground in front of the shed. It read, "Caldwell's Heritage Gas Station grand opening soon," with smaller print listing community benefits like increased property values and reduced fuel costs. Ethan tore the sign out of the ground and tossed it aside, his anger reaching a boiling point. He had tried to remain reasonable and follow proper procedures, but Sandra had made it clear she didn't care about rules or fairness. If she wanted to fight, he was prepared to ensure she regretted initiating it. Ethan awoke the next morning with a sense of urgent determination. The past few days felt less like a nightmare and more like a calculated assault on his peace of mind. Sandra wasn't just an overbearing neighbor anymore. She had crossed into dangerous territory, threatening his property and, in some ways, his very identity. The shed had become more than just a building to him. It was a symbol of his bond with Linda, a piece of his life he had managed to preserve despite his losses. Now, Sandra was attempting to take it away under the guise of community improvement. Ethan was resolved not to let that happen. He spent the morning sifting through every legal document he had, searching for anything that might bolster his case against Sandra. Deed records, tax receipts, and property line surveys were scattered across his dining room table like puzzle pieces. He meticulously organized them into a file, intent on demonstrating to the city and anyone else who would listen that Sandra's claims were unfounded. But as he worked, a nagging sense of unease gnawed at the back of his mind. Sandra's confidence didn't arise from nowhere. She had to have some form of leverage, and he needed to uncover it before it was too late. By mid-afternoon, Ethan decided to take a walk around the shed to assess the situation firsthand. As he approached, he noticed that the construction activity had only intensified. More workers were present, operating heavy machinery and laying what appeared to be the foundation for a new fuel pump station. The scaffolding had grown taller, and the shed itself was now partially concealed by a tarp bearing the Palmer's Heritage Gas Station logo. Ethan's blood boiled at the sight, but he knew better than to confront the workers directly. They were merely doing their jobs, likely unaware of the legal battle unfolding around them. Instead, Ethan focused on the surrounding area. He observed that sections of his property, far beyond the shed's immediate vicinity, had been disturbed. Tracks from heavy vehicles crisscrossed his yard, and several wooden stakes with bright orange flags had been driven into the ground at irregular intervals. It seemed Sandra or someone working for her was attempting to extend the construction scope beyond the shed itself. Ethan bent down to inspect one of the stakes, removing it from the ground to reveal a handwritten label that read, "Boundary Adjustment Pending." That was it. Sandra wasn't just claiming the shed. She was trying to redraw the property lines entirely. Ethan felt a surge of anger, but it was swiftly replaced by determination. He took out his phone and began photographing the stakes, the tracks, and the construction site as evidence. If Sandra wanted a legal battle, he would ensure she regretted it. Later that day, Ethan visited Alice's office, the lawyer he had consulted earlier in the week. Alice was a sharp, no-nonsense woman with a reputation for handling tough cases, and Ethan felt a renewed sense of hope as he explained the situation to her. He showed her the photos, the documents, and the stake he had removed from the ground. Alice listened attentively, occasionally jotting down notes as Ethan spoke. "This isn't just a case of trespassing anymore," Alice said when he finished. "If she's trying to alter the property lines, that's a whole different level of fraud. We'll need to file an injunction to stop the construction immediately. But be warned, this is going to get messy. People like Sandra don't back down easily, especially when they believe they're in the right." Ethan nodded, his resolve strengthening. "I don't care how messy it gets. She's not taking my shed." Alice gave him a firm smile. "Good. Then let's get to work." In the ensuing days, Alice filed the necessary paperwork to halt Sandra's construction while Ethan focused on gathering more evidence. He spent hours at the county clerk's office, poring over old records in hopes of finding anything that could disprove Sandra's claims about the shed's history. He also began speaking to his neighbors, trying to gauge how much support Sandra had managed to garner. To his dismay, many of them seemed hesitant to take a side. "She's been talking about that gas station for weeks," one neighbor admitted when Ethan visited her. "It'll bring more business and increase property values. Honestly, a lot of us are on board with the idea. No offense, Ethan, but the shed has been an eyesore for years." Ethan refrained from responding, realizing that Sandra had expertly spun the narrative in her favor. She had positioned herself as a proponent of progress while portraying him as a stubborn individual, clinging to a piece of the past. It was infuriating. But Ethan knew he couldn't win this battle based solely on emotion. He needed concrete evidence to prove that Sandra was lying, and he needed it quickly. One evening, as Ethan was reviewing the day's findings in his living room, he heard the faint sound of footsteps outside. He froze, his ears straining to discern the noise. It was subtle but unmistakable. Someone was walking around his property. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, his heart pounding as he scanned the yard. At first, he saw nothing but darkness and shadows. Then, near the shed, his flashlight beam caught a figure darting behind a stack of construction materials. "Hey, Ethan," he shouted, his voice cutting through the night. "Who's there?" The figure didn't respond, but Ethan could hear the crunch of gravel as they retreated toward the woods. He chased after them, adrenaline propelling his movements, but by the time he reached the tree line, the intruder was gone. Frustrated, Ethan turned back toward the shed where he noticed something strange. One of the construction vehicles, a large backhoe, had been tampered with. The fuel cap was missing, and a pool of liquid shimmered on the ground beneath it. Ethan crouched down to inspect the spill, his mind racing with possibilities. Had the intruder been attempting to sabotage the equipment, or was this some kind of setup to make him appear guilty? Either way, it was evident that the situation was escalating, and he needed to be more vigilant than ever. The next morning, Ethan installed a series of motion-activated cameras around his property, determined to catch whoever was trespassing. He also began documenting everything meticulously, from the state of the construction site to his interactions with Sandra and her workers. It was exhausting, but Ethan knew that every piece of evidence he gathered could make or break his case. A few days later, Alice called with an update. "The injunction has been approved," she informed him. "That means Sandra has to stop all construction until the property dispute is resolved. If she violates the order, she'll face legal consequences." For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a flicker of hope, but that hope was short-lived. When he returned home that evening, he found a new sign nailed to the ground near the shed. It read, "Construction temporarily paused. Grand opening date TBD." Below the text was a handwritten note that said, "Nice try, Ethan." Ethan ripped the sign from the ground and tossed it aside, his frustration reaching its peak. Sandra was taunting him, challenging him to continue fighting. Instead of feeling defeated, Ethan felt a surge of determination. If Sandra wanted to play dirty, he would be ready. The shed was no longer just a building. It had become a battleground, and Ethan was prepared to fight for it with everything he had. His conflict with Sandra had grown into something far more significant than he had anticipated. What began as a seemingly absurd property dispute over the shed had spiraled into a war of attrition that consumed his every waking moment. The temporary injunction Alice had secured to halt Sandra's construction provided Ethan with a brief sense of relief. But it was fleeting. Sandra had made it clear she wasn't backing down, and her blatant defiance of the order only fueled Ethan's determination to see this through to the very end. Yet, with every step forward, new challenges emerged, testing Ethan's resolve in ways he hadn't imagined. The first sign of trouble appeared just days after the injunction was issued. Ethan returned home from a meeting with Alice to find that someone had spray-painted the words "Community Hero" across the side of Sandra's makeshift scaffolding. It was clearly intended to mock him, a pointed jab suggesting that Sandra had somehow convinced the neighborhood she was the one acting in their best interest. Sure enough, Ethan soon began hearing whispers from his neighbors about how selfish he was being, how he was obstructing progress for the sake of an old rundown shed. It was a narrative Sandra had meticulously crafted, and it was effective. Sandra didn't just rely on words to sway public opinion. She had also turned the dispute into a spectacle. One afternoon, Ethan was startled to see a small crowd gathered near the shed, watching as Sandra stood on a makeshift platform delivering an impassioned speech. She spoke of preserving history, revitalizing the community, and overcoming bureaucratic obstacles. Her audience, a mix of curious onlookers and enthusiastic supporters, clapped and cheered as she unveiled her grand vision for the gas station. Ethan watched from a distance, seething as Sandra smiled and gestured toward the shed as if it were already hers. What infuriated Ethan the most was Sandra's effortless ability to manipulate people. She had transformed the dispute into a popularity contest, and he was losing. Neighbors who once sympathized with him were now questioning his motives, while Sandra basked in the attention. But Ethan knew the truth. Her so-called vision wasn't about benefiting the community. It was about control and greed. The shed was merely a pawn in her larger scheme, and Ethan had no intention of letting her win. Desperate to shift the narrative, he decided to intensify his efforts to gather evidence. He combed through county records, searching for anything that could discredit Sandra's claims about the shed being part of her family's historical property. What he found wasn't a definitive proof, but it was enough to raise doubts. Old zoning maps and property records revealed clear inconsistencies in Sandra's story. The shed had always been part of Ethan's land, and there was no record of it ever belonging to her family. Armed with this information, Ethan contacted Alice, who agreed to incorporate it into their case. But Ethan soon realized that facts alone weren't sufficient to stop Sandra. The next escalation came in the form of a letter taped to his front door, bearing the letterhead of the local zoning board. The letter claimed that Sandra had filed a new petition to have the shed declared a historical landmark, a move that, if approved, would effectively override Ethan's ownership rights. The petition referenced vague claims about the shed's architectural significance and cultural importance, supported by what Sandra described as expert testimony. It was a bold maneuver, clearly intended to delay the legal process and give Sandra more time to cement her control. Ethan immediately contacted the zoning board, hoping to refute the petition before it gained momentum. However, the process was slow, mired in bureaucratic red tape and conflicting schedules. In the meantime, Sandra continued to advance, holding meetings with community members and even organizing a fundraiser to support her preservation efforts. She framed the situation as a battle between progress and resistance, painting Ethan as a stubborn relic of the past. It was maddening, but Ethan refused to stoop to her level. He focused instead on strengthening his case, determined to let the truth prevail. The tension reached a boiling point one evening when Ethan witnessed Sandra and a group of workers sneaking onto his property under the cover of darkness. He had been monitoring the motion-activated cameras he had installed around the shed, and the footage showed Sandra directing the workers to install what appeared to be temporary fuel storage tanks. It was a blatant violation of the injunction, and Ethan knew he had to act swiftly. He grabbed his phone and called Alice, who advised him to document everything and contact the authorities. By the time the sheriff's deputies arrived, Sandra was gone, leaving the workers scrambling to explain themselves. The deputies issued a warning, but it was clear they weren't eager to get involved in what they perceived as a neighborly squabble. Frustrated but undeterred, Ethan ensured the footage was sent to Alice, who promised to include it in their case. But even as they built their argument, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Sandra was always one step ahead. This suspicion was confirmed a few days later when Ethan received an unexpected visitor at his door. The man introduced himself as a representative from a regional fuel company, claiming to be interested in partnering with Sandra on her gas station project. He spoke vaguely about investment opportunities and community growth, but Ethan could tell he was fishing for information. The man casually mentioned that Sandra had described Ethan as a reluctant participant in the project, implying that he might be open to selling the property if the price was right. Ethan didn't bother hiding his disgust. He made it clear that he had no intention of selling, and the man left with a thinly veiled warning. Think about it. Opportunities like this don't come around often. The encounter left Ethan shaken but resolute. Sandra wasn't just trying to take his shed. She was building an entire network of allies and backers to legitimize her scheme. It was no longer just a local dispute. It was a coordinated effort with real money and influence behind it. Ethan realized that to win, he couldn't fight this battle alone. He reached out to a local historical society, hoping to enlist their support in debunking Sandra's claims about the shed's historical significance. To his relief, they agreed to investigate, and their findings confirmed what Ethan already knew. Sandra's story was a fabrication, filled with half-truths and outright lies. Armed with this new evidence, Ethan and Alice prepared to escalate their case. They filed additional motions to challenge Sandra's petition and requested a formal review of her activities by the zoning board. But even as the legal processes moved forward, Sandra continued to push boundaries. One morning, Ethan woke to find a new sign nailed to the ground near the shed. It read, "Community Survey. Should the gas station proceed?" Beneath the bold letters was a QR code directing people to a website where they could vote on the project. It was a clever tactic, designed to rally public support and undermine Ethan's legal position. Despite everything, Ethan refused to back down. He knew Sandra was attempting to wear him down, to exhaust him into surrendering. But the shed was more than just a piece of property. It was a fragment of his life, a connection to Linda, and a symbol of his resilience. He wasn't going to let Sandra or anyone else take that away from him. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan braced himself for the next phase of the fight, knowing that the toughest battles were still ahead. Ethan believed he was prepared for anything Sandra could throw his way, but the next phase of her campaign caught him off guard. It began with a knock at his door one morning. Standing on his porch were two uniformed officers, flanked by a man in a sharp suit, who introduced himself as a compliance inspector for the local zoning board. The man informed Ethan with a tone dripping in condescension that a formal complaint had been filed against him alleging violations of local regulations regarding the condition of his property. Specifically, Sandra had claimed that the shed was a safety hazard, citing structural instability and potential environmental concerns. Ethan's jaw tightened as he listened, but he forced himself to remain composed. He knew Sandra's tactics well enough by now to recognize this as another attempt to undermine him and divert his attention from the larger battle over the shed. He allowed the inspector to conduct his assessment, silently seething as the man poked around the shed, taking notes and snapping photos of things as minor as peeling paint and uneven floorboards. When the inspector concluded, he informed Ethan that he would review the findings and notify him if further action was necessary. The entire ordeal left Ethan rattled. Sandra was clearly weaponizing every bureaucratic tool at her disposal to make his life as difficult as possible. And it wasn't just the inspector. Later that same day, Ethan noticed unfamiliar cars idling near the edge of his property, their occupants watching the shed with thinly veiled interest. He didn't approach them, but their presence made his skin crawl. Things escalated further that evening when Ethan discovered that someone had tampered with the motion-activated cameras he had installed around his property. Two of the cameras were missing entirely, their mounts ripped from the trees, while a third had been smashed, its lens shattered and wires dangling. Furious, Ethan spent the next few hours replacing the equipment and reinforcing the mounts, vowing to catch whoever was responsible. The following morning, Ethan awoke to a new and far more disturbing sight. Parked just beyond the shed was a flatbed truck carrying several large barrels marked with hazardous material warnings. A group of workers stood nearby, conversing in hushed tones and pointing toward the shed. Ethan didn't recognize them, and when he approached to demand an explanation, they scattered like startled deer. The truck sped away moments later, leaving behind deep tire ruts in the soft ground. Ethan immediately called Alice to report the incident, and she advised him to file a formal complaint with the sheriff's department. But when the deputies arrived, they seemed disinterested, dismissing the barrels as probably just a mix-up and offering little reassurance. "It's not illegal to park on the roadside," one of them said with a shrug. "Unless they're on your land, there's not much we can do." Frustrated but undeterred, Ethan decided to take matters into his own hands. He began conducting his own late-night patrols of the property, flashlight in one hand and a crowbar in the other. On the second night, his vigilance paid off. Just after midnight, he caught a pair of men in dark clothing attempting to unload more barrels near the shed. They froze when Ethan's flashlight beam swept over them, and for a tense moment, no one moved. Then one of the men bolted, disappearing into the woods, while the other tried to bluff his way out of the situation. "We're with the zoning board," the man stammered, his voice unconvincing. "Just conducting an inspection." "Inspection at midnight with unmarked barrels?" Ethan growled, stepping closer. "Try again." The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned and ran, leaving the barrels behind. Ethan didn't bother chasing him. Instead, he inspected the barrels, noting that they were unsealed and appeared to contain nothing but dirt and rubble. It was clear this wasn't about hazardous materials. It was another staged scene designed to create the appearance of violations that Sandra could use against him. Ethan hauled the barrels away himself, disposing of them far from his property to prevent any further tampering, but the incident left him rattled. Sandra wasn't just trying to discredit him. She was escalating to outright sabotage, and she had no qualms about employing hired help to do her dirty work. In the days that followed, Sandra intensified her efforts even further. Ethan began receiving anonymous letters in the mail, each filled with vague threats and accusations. "You're a danger to this community," one letter read. "Sell the property before someone gets hurt." Another warned, "The shed isn't worth your life." Ethan didn't share the letters with Alice right away, partly because he didn't want to appear paranoid and partly because he didn't want to admit even to himself how much they unsettled him. But the breaking point came when he found a similar note taped to the windshield of his truck, accompanied by a crudely drawn map showing the shed circled in red. The implication was clear. Sandra or someone working with her was closely monitoring him. That evening, Ethan finally decided to confront Sandra directly. He marched over to her house, his fists clenched and his heart pounding with a mix of anger and frustration. Sandra greeted him at the door with her usual saccharine smile, feigning surprise at his sudden appearance. "What brings you here?" she asked sweetly, as if they were old friends catching up. "You know exactly why I'm here," Ethan snapped. "The barrels, the letters, the sabotage, it ends now. If you think I'm going to let you scare me off, you're dead wrong." Sandra's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said innocently. "I've been busy with my gas station project. If something's happening on your property, maybe you should take it up with the authorities." Her words were like gasoline on a fire. "You mean the authorities you've been feeding lies to?" Ethan shot back. "You can play innocent all you want, Sandra, but I know what you're doing, and I'm not going anywhere." Sandra tilted her head, her smile growing sharper. "Well, Ethan, I guess we'll just have to see who runs out of steam first. But you'd be careful if you were me. People who make enemies tend to regret it." It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. Ethan left her porch feeling more determined than ever, but he couldn't shake the weight of her words. Sandra wasn't bluffing, and she clearly had resources at her disposal that he didn't. But what Sandra didn't realize was that Ethan had reached his limit. He was done playing defense. The next morning, Ethan began preparing for what he knew would be the toughest phase of the battle. He reached out to Alice and shared everything. The letters, the barrels, the midnight trespassers. Together, they devised a plan to escalate their case, filing formal complaints not just with the zoning board, but with state authorities as well. Alice also recommended hiring a private investigator to delve into Sandra's connections, hoping to uncover any ties that might explain her seemingly endless supply of resources. For Ethan, the fight had become deeply personal. Sandra's campaign of intimidation wasn't just an attack on his property. It was an assault on his life, his memories, and everything he held dear. But if Sandra thought she could break him, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. Ethan wasn't backing down. He was gearing up for war. Ethan had always seen himself as a rational man. He preferred plans over improvisation, patience over haste, and order over chaos. But the situation with Sandra had pushed him far beyond his limits. Weeks of harassment, sabotage, and bureaucratic obstacles had turned his life into a waking nightmare. Yet through it all, one thing remained constant: his determination to protect the shed. It wasn't just about the building anymore. It was about standing up to Sandra, who had trampled every boundary and ignored every rule in her relentless pursuit of control. It was about proving to himself and to her that he wouldn't be intimidated, no matter how far she went. The tipping point came when Ethan received a letter from the zoning board informing him that Sandra's petition to have the shed declared a historical landmark had been expedited for approval. The letter included a notice that a public hearing would be held in just a few days to finalize the designation. If Sandra succeeded, the shed would be effectively removed from Ethan's ownership, granting her control over its use under the guise of preservation. The sheer audacity of it left Ethan seething. He knew Sandra had pulled strings to fast-track the process, bypassing the usual months-long delays. It was a clear abuse of the system, but Ethan also knew it was his last chance to stop her. Alice was just as furious when Ethan showed her the letter. "She's playing dirty," Alice said, pacing her office as she reviewed the notice. "But this might actually work in our favor. A public hearing means we can present our evidence directly in front of witnesses. Sandra can't control the narrative if we take it away from her." Ethan nodded, though he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. Sandra always seemed to be one step ahead, and he doubted this would be any different. Still, he spent the next few days preparing for the hearing with Alice, compiling every piece of evidence they had gathered. The photographs of the construction, the forged documents, the footage of trespassers. All of it was organized into a clear, irrefutable case. Ethan rehearsed his statement late into the night, determined to make every word count. The day of the hearing arrived, and Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he entered the municipal building. The room was small but packed, with Sandra seated front and center, flanked by a handful of supporters. She wore a tailored blazer and her signature smug smile, projecting an air of calm confidence. It was a stark contrast to Ethan, who felt the weight of the entire ordeal pressing down on him. But as he took his seat beside Alice, he reminded himself why he was there. This wasn't just about winning. It was about doing what was right. The hearing began with a representative from the zoning board outlining the purpose of the meeting, to determine whether the shed met the criteria for historical preservation. Sandra was the first to speak, delivering a polished and rehearsed statement about the shed's deep ties to the community and its unique architectural value. She waved a stack of documents in the air, claiming they were proof of her family's historical connection to the property. Her supporters nodded along, and a few board members even looked impressed. When it was Ethan's turn, he stood and took a deep breath. "My name is Ethan Caldwell," he began, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I own the property in question, including the shed. What you've just heard is a carefully constructed story designed to deceive you. I'm here to present the truth." Ethan methodically laid out his case, presenting the original deed to his property, the updated surveys showing the shed well within his boundaries, and the county records disproving Sandra's claims about her family's connection to the structure. He showed photographs of the construction work and played video footage of the trespassers, highlighting their connection to Sandra's operation. Finally, he held up the zoning board's own regulations, emphasizing how Sandra's petition violated several key provisions. As he spoke, he noticed Sandra's composure begin to falter. Her smile wavered, and she whispered frantically to one of her supporters. Ethan pressed on, underscoring the lengths Sandra had gone to manipulate the system and intimidate him into relinquishing his property. "This isn't about preserving history," he declared, his voice rising. "It's about control. Sandra Palmer has no legal or moral right to that shed, and everything she's done proves she's willing to break the rules to get what she wants." When he concluded, the room fell silent for a moment before murmurs spread through the crowd. The zoning board members exchanged glances, clearly unsettled by what they had just heard. Sandra's supporters attempted to counter with vague defenses and appeals to emotion, but the evidence Ethan and Alice had presented was overwhelming. Then, in a surprising move, Alice stood and announced that they had one final piece of evidence to present. She handed the board a document they had uncovered just the night before, a legal notice showing that Sandra had been fined years ago for falsifying property records in an unrelated dispute. It was a smoking gun, proof that Sandra had a history of dishonesty concerning land claims. Sandra sprang to her feet, her face flushed with anger. "This is a witch hunt," she shouted, her carefully crafted image unraveling. "I'm trying to help this community, and you're all too blind to see it." But her outburst only weakened her case. The zoning board deliberated for less than an hour before issuing their decision. Sandra's petition was denied, and an investigation would be launched into her activities related to the shed. As the ruling was read aloud, Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. For the first time in weeks, he could breathe again. Sandra stormed out of the room without a word, her supporters trailing behind her. Ethan watched her leave, knowing this wasn't the last he would hear from her. But for now, he had won. The shed was safe, and Sandra's campaign of harassment had been exposed for what it was. As Ethan left the municipal building, he allowed himself a small smile. The fight wasn't over, but he had proven that standing up for what was right was worth the struggle. And no matter what Sandra tried next, he was ready. The days following the hearing were unusually quiet. For the first time in months, Ethan wasn't awakened by the sound of trucks outside his shed or finding threatening notes left on his property. Sandra had retreated, her supporters dispersing almost as quickly as they had rallied behind her. The shed stood untouched, a silent monument to the battle Ethan had fought and won. But the victory felt less like a triumph and more like a hard-earned reprieve. He knew Sandra too well to believe she would give up entirely. Still, for the moment, he allowed himself a rare sense of peace. Ethan spent the next week repairing the damage done to his property. The tracks left by Sandra's construction vehicles were filled in, the motion cameras were reinstalled, and the shed itself was finally free of scaffolding and debris. As he worked, he reflected on how much had changed since the fight began. The shed wasn't just a project anymore. It was a symbol of everything he had fought for: his connection to Linda, his right to his own land, and his refusal to be bullied into submission. Alice kept him updated on the aftermath of the hearing. Sandra was now under investigation for multiple violations, including forging documents and trespassing. The fines alone were enough to cripple her finances, and the zoning board had issued a formal cease and desist order on all her activities related to the shed. Ethan had heard through the grapevine that Sandra was furious, ranting about small-minded people and threatening to appeal the decision, but her threats rang hollow as her credibility was shattered. Even her most loyal supporters had begun to distance themselves. One afternoon, Ethan received an unexpected visitor. It was one of his neighbors, an older man named Roy, who had always kept to himself. Roy held a small box in his hands and looked sheepish as he approached. "Thought I should bring you this," he said, handing the box to Ethan. "Found it in my attic the other day, some old photos and papers that might interest you." Curious, Ethan opened the box and found a collection of faded photographs and yellowed documents. One of the photos showed the shed as it had looked decades ago, surrounded by farmland and a few scattered trees. In the corner of the photo was a handwritten note. "Caldwell Family Shed, 1932. The documents included old property records and letters between previous owners, all of which further confirmed that the shed had always been part of Ethan's land. "Why give this to me now?" Ethan asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. Roy scratched the back of his neck. "Sandra came by a few months ago, trying to convince me to sign something about the shed. Said it was for historical preservation. I didn't trust her, but I didn't want to get involved either. After seeing what she put you through, I figured it was time to do the right thing." Ethan thanked Roy sincerely, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and frustration. If more people had spoken up earlier, the fight might not have dragged on for so long. But he also understood how Sandra had managed to manipulate and intimidate others into silence. She had relied on fear and division to achieve her goals, and for a while, it had worked. With the additional documents in hand, Ethan decided to host a small gathering at his property. He invited the neighbors who had supported him, along with a few who had wavered during the conflict but had since reached out to apologize. It wasn't a grand event, just a simple barbecue near the shed to celebrate its survival and the community's renewed sense of unity. As the sun set that evening, Ethan stood by the shed, watching as the warm light bathed its weathered wood. For the first time, he felt a sense of closure. The shed was no longer just a relic of the past. It was a testament to resilience, a reminder that some things were worth fighting for. The battle with Sandra had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, but it had also reminded him of his own strength and the importance of standing up for what mattered. When the last guest had left, Ethan took a moment to sit on the steps of the shed, a cup of coffee warming his hands. The night was quiet, the kind of peaceful silence he hadn't experienced in months. He looked up at the shed and smiled, a genuine smile that came from knowing he had done the right thing. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Ethan was ready to face them. For now, though, he allowed himself to simply enjoy the calm. The shed was his, and it always would be.